The Battle of Wounded Knee. A comprehensive examination. The Battle of Wounded Knee, often referred to as the Wounded Knee Massacre, stands as one of the most tragic and significant events in the history of the United States, particularly in the context of Native American history. Occurring on December 29, 1890, near Wounded Knee Creek on the Lakota Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota, this event marked a devastating end to the centuries-long conflict between Native American tribes and the U.S. government. The battle resulted in the deaths of approximately 150 to 300 Lakota men, women, and children, many of whom were unarmed. This article aims to provide a comprehensive examination of the Battle of Wounded Knee, exploring its historical context, the events leading up to the massacre, the battle itself, its aftermath, and its lasting impact on Native American communities and U.S. history. Historical context. The Lakota Sioux and the Great Sioux War. To understand the Battle of Wounded Knee, it is essential to delve into the historical context of the Lakota Sioux and their relationship with the U.S. government. The Lakota, part of the larger Sioux Nation, were a powerful and nomadic tribe that inhabited the Great Plains, including present-day South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska, Wyoming, and Montana. The Lakota were known for their warrior culture, deep spiritual beliefs, and resistance to European American encroachment on their lands. The mid-19th century saw increasing tensions between the Lakota and the U.S. government, particularly as westward expansion intensified. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills in the 1870s led to a rush of settlers and miners into the region, which was sacred to the Lakota. The U.S. government sought to acquire the Black Hills, leading to the Great Sioux War of 1876–77. This conflict included several significant battles, most notably the Battle of the Little Bighorn, where Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, defeated General George Custer and the 7th Cavalry. Despite this victory, the U.S. government continued to exert pressure on the Lakota, leading to the eventual surrender of many tribal leaders and the confinement of the Lakota to reservations. The Treaty of Fort Laramie, 1868, had guaranteed the Lakota the Black Hills and hunting rights in the surrounding areas, but the U.S. government violated the treaty, leading to further resentment and resistance among the Lakota. The Ghost Dance movement. In the late 1880s, a new religious movement known as the Ghost Dance emerged among Native American tribes, including the Lakota. The Ghost Dance was founded by Wovoka, a Paiute prophet, who preached a message of hope, renewal, and the return of the old ways. Wovoka's teachings included the belief that performing the Ghost Dance would bring about the resurrection of deceased ancestors, the return of the buffalo, and the removal of European Americans from native lands. The Ghost Dance movement spread rapidly among the Lakota, who were suffering from the loss of their traditional way of life, forced assimilation, and the devastating effects of disease and starvation on the reservations. The U.S. government viewed the Ghost Dance as a threat, fearing that it would incite rebellion among the Native American tribes. In response, the government banned the Ghost Dance and increased military presence on the reservations. The death of Sitting Bull. One of the key events leading up to the Battle of Wounded Knee was the death of Sitting Bull, a revered Lakota leader and spiritual figure. Sitting Bull had been a prominent leader during the Great Sioux War and had later joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, where he gained fame and notoriety. However, he remained a symbol of resistance and defiance against U.S. government policies. In December 1890, the U.S. government, fearing that Sitting Bull would support the Ghost Dance movement, ordered his arrest. On December 15, 1890, a group of Indian police officers attempted to arrest Sitting Bull at his home on the Standing Rock Reservation. A confrontation ensued, resulting in the death of Sitting Bull and several of his followers. The death of Sitting Bull further inflamed tensions among the Lakota and contributed to the growing sense of unease and fear on the reservations. The events leading to the Battle of Wounded Knee. The flight of Bigfoot's band. Following the death of Sitting Bull, many Lakota, fearing further reprisals from the U.S. government, fled their reservations. Among them was Bigfoot, also known as Spotted Elk, a Lakota chief who led a band of Minneconjou Lakota. Bigfoot's band, which included approximately 350 people, many of whom were women and children, sought refuge at the Pine Ridge Reservation, where they hoped to find safety and support from other Lakota. However, the U.S. military was determined to prevent the Lakota from gathering and potentially joining forces. On December 28, 1890, Bigfoot's band was intercepted by the 7th Cavalry, led by Major Samuel M. Whitside, near Porcupine Butte. Bigfoot, who was suffering from pneumonia, surrendered peacefully, and the band was escorted to a campsite near Wounded Knee Creek. The camp at Wounded Knee Creek was established under the supervision of the 7th Cavalry, which had been ordered to disarm Bigfoot's band and prevent any potential uprising. The Lakota were surrounded by heavily armed soldiers, and tensions were high. The soldiers were instructed to confiscate all weapons from the Lakota, a task that was met with resistance and fear. On the morning of December 29, 1890, the soldiers began the process of disarming the Lakota. The Lakota, many of whom were reluctant to give up their weapons, were subjected to harsh and aggressive treatment. As the soldiers searched the camp, a scuffle broke out, and a shot was fired. The exact circumstances of the first shot remain unclear, but it triggered a violent and chaotic response from the soldiers. The Battle of Wounded Knee. The massacre. The initial shot led to a rapid escalation of violence. The 7th Cavalry, armed with Hotchkiss guns, light artillery pieces, opened fire on the Lakota camp. The soldiers, many of whom were veterans of the Indian Wars, showed little mercy, firing indiscriminately into the crowd of men, women, and children. The Lakota, many of whom were unarmed and caught off guard, were unable to mount an effective defense. The massacre lasted for less than an hour, but the carnage was devastating. Estimates of the number of Lakota killed vary, but it is believed that between 150 and 300 men, women, and children lost their lives. Some were killed instantly, while others died from their wounds in the days and weeks that followed. The soldiers also suffered casualties, with 25 killed and 39 wounded, many of whom were likely victims of friendly fire. The immediate aftermath of the massacre was marked by chaos and confusion. The surviving Lakota, many of whom were wounded and traumatized, were left to fend for themselves in the freezing winter conditions. The soldiers, under orders to bury the dead, hastily interred the bodies in a mass grave. The wounded were transported to a nearby Episcopal mission, where they received minimal medical care. The U.S. government initially portrayed the massacre as a necessary action to suppress a potential uprising. However, as news of the event spread, public opinion began to shift. Many Americans were horrified by the brutality of the massacre, and it sparked a national debate about the treatment of Native Americans. The event also led to a reassessment of U.S. Indian policy. Although meaningful reforms were slow to come, the impact of the Battle of Wounded Knee on the Lakota and Native American communities. The Battle of Wounded Knee had a profound and lasting impact on the Lakota and other Native American communities. The massacre marked the end of armed resistance by Native Americans against the U.S. government and symbolized the final chapter in the centuries-long struggle for Native American sovereignty and land rights. For the Lakota, the massacre was a traumatic and devastating event that left deep scars on their community. The loss of so many lives, including women and children, was a profound tragedy that continues to be remembered and mourned. The massacre also had a significant impact on the cultural and spiritual identity of the Lakota, as it represented the destruction of their traditional way of life and the imposition of U.S. government control. In the years following the massacre, the Lakota and other Native American tribes were subjected to further assimilation policies, including the forced removal of children to boarding schools, the suppression of native languages and religions, and the allotment of tribal lands. These policies had a lasting impact on Native American communities, contributing to the erosion of cultural traditions and the marginalization of Native peoples. On U.S. history and policy. The Battle of Wounded Knee also had a significant impact on U.S. history and policy. The massacre exposed the brutality and injustice of U.S. government actions toward Native Americans and led to increased scrutiny of federal Indian policy. In the years following the massacre, there were calls for reform, although meaningful changes were slow to materialize. The massacre also had a lasting impact on the U.S. military. The 7th Cavalry, which had been involved in the massacre, faced criticism and scrutiny for its actions. The event tarnished the reputation of the regiment, which had previously been celebrated for its role in the Indian Wars. The massacre also led to a reassessment of military tactics and policies in dealing with Native American tribes. On public perception and memory. The Battle of Wounded Knee has had a complex and evolving legacy in American public memory. In the immediate aftermath of the massacre, it was often portrayed as a necessary and justified action to maintain order and protect settlers. However, as time passed, the event came to be seen in a different light, with many recognizing it as a tragic and unjustifiable act of violence against Native Americans. In the 20th century, the massacre became a symbol of the broader struggles faced by Native Americans in their fight for justice, sovereignty, and recognition. The event has been commemorated in various ways, including through literature, art, and activism. The American Indian Movement, AIM, a Native American advocacy group, played a significant role in bringing attention to the massacre and its legacy, particularly during the 1973 occupation of Wounded Knee, which sought to highlight ongoing issues faced by Native American communities. The Battle of Wounded Knee remains a poignant and powerful reminder of the complex and often tragic history of Native American and U.S. government relations. The massacre, which resulted in the deaths of hundreds of Lakota men, women, and children, marked the end of armed resistance by Native Americans and symbolized the broader struggles faced by Native peoples in their fight for sovereignty, land rights, and cultural survival. The legacy of Wounded Knee continues to resonate today, as Native American communities work to preserve their cultural heritage, address historical injustices, and advocate for their rights. The massacre serves as a stark reminder of the need for reconciliation, understanding, and justice in the ongoing relationship between Native Americans and the U.S. government. As we reflect on the events of December 29, 1890, it is essential to remember the lives lost at Wounded Knee and to honor the resilience and strength of the Lakota and other Native American communities. The Battle of Wounded Knee is not just a historical event, it is a living memory that continues to shape the present and future of Native American peoples and the United States as a whole. The long-term impacts of the Wounded Knee Massacre on the Lakota people. The Battle of Wounded Knee, often referred to as the Wounded Knee Massacre, occurred on December 29, 1890, near Wounded Knee Creek on the Lakota Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. This tragic event marked one of the final confrontations in the long series of conflicts between the United States government and the Native American tribes, particularly the Lakota Sioux. The massacre resulted in the deaths of approximately 150 to 300 Lakota men, women, and children, many of whom were unarmed. The event has had profound and lasting impacts on the Lakota people, shaping their cultural, social, political, and economic realities for generations. This article explores the long-term impacts of the Wounded Knee Massacre on the Lakota people, examining its effects on their identity, sovereignty, and ongoing struggles for justice and recognition. Historical context. The Lakota Sioux and the U.S. government. The Lakota Sioux, part of the larger Sioux Nation, were once a powerful and autonomous people who roamed the Great Plains. Their way of life was deeply connected to the land, and they were known for their warrior culture, spiritual practices, and communal living. However, the arrival of European settlers and the westward expansion of the United States brought significant challenges to their existence. The U.S. government's policies towards Native Americans were characterized by a series of treaties, many of which were broken or ignored. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, for example, guaranteed the Lakota ownership of the Black Hills, a sacred land to them. However, the discovery of gold in the Black Hills led to an influx of settlers and miners, and the U.S. government sought to acquire the land, leading to the Great Sioux War of 1876–77. The defeat of General George Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876 was a significant victory for the Lakota, but it also intensified the U.S. government's efforts to subjugate them. The Ghost Dance movement. By the late 19th century, the Lakota people were facing dire circumstances. The buffalo, their primary source of sustenance, had been nearly exterminated, and they were confined to reservations with limited resources. In this context, the Ghost Dance movement emerged as a spiritual revival among Native American tribes. The Ghost Dance was believed to have the power to restore the Native way of life, bring back the buffalo, and even cause the disappearance of the white settlers. The U.S. government viewed the Ghost Dance as a threat, fearing that it would incite rebellion. This fear led to the decision to arrest Sitting Bull, a prominent Lakota leader, in December 1890. His arrest and subsequent death during a confrontation with Indian agents heightened tensions among the Lakota. Many of Sitting Bull's followers fled to join Chief Spotted Elk, also known as Bigfoot, and his band, who were later intercepted by the U.S. Army near Wounded Knee Creek. The Wounded Knee Massacre. On the morning of December 29, 1890, the U.S. Army's 7th Cavalry surrounded Spotted Elk's band, which consisted of about 350 Lakota, mostly women and children. The soldiers demanded that the Lakota surrender their weapons. During the disarmament process, a shot was fired, and the situation quickly escalated into a massacre. The soldiers opened fire with Hotchkiss guns, a type of light artillery, killing many Lakota in a matter of minutes. Those who tried to flee were pursued and killed. The exact number of casualties is disputed, but it is estimated that between 150 and 300 Lakota were killed, including many unarmed women and children. The Wounded Knee Massacre marked the end of armed resistance by the Lakota and other Native American tribes against the U.S. government. It was a devastating blow to the Lakota people, who had already suffered immense losses due to disease, starvation, and the destruction of their way of life. Long-term impacts on the Lakota people. Cultural trauma and identity. The Wounded Knee Massacre left a deep scar on the collective psyche of the Lakota people. The event is remembered not only as a physical massacre but also as a cultural and spiritual trauma. The loss of so many lives, including elders, women, and children, disrupted the transmission of traditional knowledge, language, and cultural practices. The massacre also symbolized the broader genocide and cultural erasure that Native American tribes experienced at the hands of the U.S. government. For many Lakota, the massacre is a painful reminder of the violence and oppression they have endured. It has become a symbol of their resilience and resistance, but it has also contributed to a sense of historical trauma that continues to affect the community. The trauma of Wounded Knee is intergenerational, passed down through stories, memories, and the ongoing struggles of the Lakota people. Loss of sovereignty and land. The Wounded Knee Massacre was a pivotal moment in the U.S. government's efforts to dismantle Native American sovereignty and assimilate them into mainstream American society. Following the massacre, the Lakota were further subjugated, and their land was increasingly taken away. The Dawes Act of 1887, which aimed to break up communal tribal lands and allocate individual plots to Native Americans, resulted in the loss of millions of acres of native land. The Lakota, like other tribes, were forced to adapt to a sedentary lifestyle, which was contrary to their traditional way of life. The loss of land had profound implications for the Lakota's ability to sustain themselves economically and culturally. The Black Hills, which are sacred to the Lakota, were taken by the U.S. government in violation of the Fort Laramie Treaty. Despite ongoing legal battles, the Lakota have not been able to reclaim this land, which remains a source of deep frustration and sorrow. Economic hardship and poverty. The economic impacts of the Wounded Knee Massacre and subsequent policies have been severe and long-lasting. The Lakota people were left with limited resources and opportunities on the reservations. The U.S. government's policies of assimilation and forced dependency on federal aid created a cycle of poverty that persists to this day. Unemployment rates on the Pine Ridge Reservation, where many Lakota live, are among the highest in the United States. Access to basic services such as healthcare, education, and housing is often inadequate. The economic challenges faced by the Lakota are compounded by the historical trauma and loss of cultural identity. Many Lakota struggle with issues such as substance abuse, mental health problems, and high rates of suicide, which are linked to the intergenerational effects of colonization and violence. Political struggles and activism. Despite the immense challenges they have faced, the Lakota people have continued to resist and fight for their rights. The Wounded Knee Massacre has become a symbol of their resilience and determination to preserve their culture and sovereignty. In the 20th century, the Lakota were at the forefront of the Native American civil rights movement, which sought to address the injustices faced by Indigenous peoples. One of the most significant moments in this struggle was the occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973 by members of the American Indian Movement, AIM, and local Lakota activists. The 71-day standoff with federal authorities brought national attention to the ongoing issues faced by Native Americans, including poverty, discrimination, and the violation of treaty rights. The occupation of Wounded Knee was a powerful act of resistance and a call for justice, but it also highlighted the deep-seated issues that continue to affect the Lakota people. Legal battles and treaty rights. The Lakota have been engaged in ongoing legal battles to assert their treaty rights and reclaim their land. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, which guaranteed the Lakota ownership of the Black Hills, has been a focal point of these efforts. In 1980, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in United States v. Sioux Nation of Indians that the Black Hills had been taken illegally and awarded the Lakota a financial settlement. However, the Lakota have refused to accept the money, insisting that the land itself be returned. The refusal to accept the settlement is a testament to the Lakota's deep connection to their land and their commitment to preserving their cultural and spiritual heritage. The legal battles over treaty rights and land claims are ongoing, and they represent a critical aspect of the Lakota's struggle for justice and self-determination, cultural revival and resilience. Despite the immense challenges they have faced, the Lakota people have shown remarkable resilience and a commitment to preserving their culture and traditions. In recent decades, there has been a resurgence of interest in Lakota language, spirituality, and cultural practices. Efforts to revitalize the Lakota language, which is endangered, have been particularly important. Language is a key component of cultural identity, and its preservation is essential for the survival of Lakota culture. Cultural events such as powwows, sun dances, and other traditional ceremonies have become important ways for the Lakota to reconnect with their heritage and pass it on to future generations. These cultural practices are not only a source of pride and identity but also a form of resistance against the forces of assimilation and erasure. Education and empowerment. Education has been a critical area of focus for the Lakota people in their efforts to overcome the legacy of Wounded Knee and other historical traumas. Many Lakota leaders and activists have emphasized the importance of education as a tool for empowerment and self-determination. Efforts to establish culturally relevant education programs that incorporate Lakota language, history, and traditions have been key to this process. Tribal colleges and universities, such as Oglala Lakota College on the Pine Ridge Reservation, play a vital role in providing higher education opportunities for Lakota students. These institutions are not only centers of learning but also important sites of cultural preservation and community development. Health and well-being. The health and well-being of the Lakota people have been deeply affected by the historical trauma and ongoing challenges they face. High rates of poverty, unemployment, and limited access to healthcare have contributed to significant health disparities. The Lakota experience higher rates of chronic diseases such as diabetes, heart disease, and cancer compared to the general U.S. population. Mental health is also a critical issue, with high rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide among the Lakota. The intergenerational trauma of events like the Wounded Knee Massacre has had a profound impact on mental health, and addressing these issues requires a holistic approach that incorporates traditional healing practices and Western medicine. Efforts to improve health outcomes for the Lakota have included the development of community-based health programs that integrate traditional healing practices with modern healthcare. These programs recognize the importance of cultural identity and spirituality in promoting health and well-being. Environmental justice. The Lakota people have a deep connection to the land, and environmental justice is a critical issue for their community. The exploitation of natural resources, such as mining and oil drilling, has had devastating impacts on the environment and the health of the Lakota people. The Black Hills, in particular, have been a site of environmental degradation due to mining activities. The Lakota have been at the forefront of environmental justice movements, advocating for the protection of their land and natural resources. The fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline, DAPL, at Standing Rock, which began in 2016, brought international attention to the issues of Indigenous rights and environmental justice. The Lakota, along with other Native American tribes, played a key role in the resistance to the pipeline, which threatened their water supply and sacred sites. The Standing Rock movement was a powerful demonstration of the Lakota's commitment to protecting their land and asserting their sovereignty. It also highlighted the ongoing struggles faced by Indigenous peoples in the face of environmental exploitation and corporate interests. The role of women in Lakota society. Lakota women have played a crucial role in the survival and resilience of their people. Traditionally, Lakota society was matrilineal, and women held significant power and influence within the community. They were responsible for the home, the education of children, and the preservation of cultural traditions. In the face of colonization and the challenges that followed, Lakota women have been at the forefront of efforts to preserve their culture and advocate for their people. In contemporary times, Lakota women continue to be leaders in their communities, working to address issues such as poverty, health disparities, and violence. They are also active in cultural revitalization efforts, ensuring that traditional knowledge and practices are passed on to future generations. The strength and resilience of Lakota women are a testament to the enduring spirit of the Lakota people. Their leadership and activism are critical to the ongoing struggle for justice, equality, and self-determination. The importance of storytelling and oral tradition. Storytelling and oral tradition have always been central to Lakota culture. Through stories, the Lakota have preserved their history, values, and spiritual beliefs. The oral tradition is a powerful means of transmitting knowledge and maintaining a connection to the past. In the aftermath of the Wounded Knee Massacre, storytelling became an important way for the Lakota to process their trauma and keep the memory of the event alive. Stories of Wounded Knee have been passed down through generations, serving as a reminder of the sacrifices made by their ancestors and the resilience of the Lakota people. Today, storytelling continues to be a vital part of Lakota culture. It is a way to educate younger generations about their history and heritage, and to inspire them to continue the struggle for justice and self-determination. Storytelling is also a form of resistance, a way to assert the Lakota's presence and voice in a world that has often sought to silence them. The role of art and expression. Art and creative expression have been important ways for the Lakota to process their experiences and assert their identity. Traditional forms of art, such as beadwork, quillwork, and painting, have been passed down through generations and continue to be practiced today. These art forms are not only a means of cultural preservation but also a way to express the Lakota's connection to their land, spirituality, and history. In contemporary times, Lakota artists have used their work to address issues such as historical trauma, environmental justice, and cultural identity. Through their art, they challenge stereotypes and misconceptions about Native Americans and assert their presence in the modern world. Art and creative expression are powerful tools for healing and empowerment. They provide a way for the Lakota to reclaim their narrative and assert their identity in the face of ongoing challenges. The impact of Christianity and missionary work. The introduction of Christianity and the work of missionaries have had a significant impact on the Lakota people. Missionaries played a key role in the U.S. government's efforts to assimilate Native Americans, often working to suppress traditional spiritual practices and convert the Lakota to Christianity. While some Lakota have embraced Christianity, others have resisted and sought to preserve their traditional spiritual beliefs. The tension between Christianity and traditional Lakota spirituality has been a source of conflict within the community, but it has also led to the development of syncretic practices that blend elements of both traditions. The impact of Christianity on the Lakota is complex and multifaceted. While it has contributed to the erosion of traditional spiritual practices, it has also provided a source of comfort and community for some Lakota. The role of Christianity in the lives of the Lakota continues to evolve, reflecting the broader struggles and resilience of the community. The role of the U.S. government and federal policies. The U.S. government's policies towards Native Americans have had a profound impact on the Lakota people. From the breaking of treaties to the forced assimilation policies of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the federal government has played a central role in the challenges faced by the Lakota. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, also known as the Wheeler-Howard Act, marked a shift in federal policy towards Native Americans. The act sought to reverse some of the damage caused by previous policies by promoting tribal self-government and cultural preservation. However, the impact of the act was mixed, and many of the challenges faced by the Lakota, such as poverty and limited access to resources, persisted. In recent decades, there have been efforts to address the historical injustices faced by Native Americans, including the Lakota. The Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975, for example, gave tribes greater control over their own affairs and resources. However, the legacy of colonization and federal policies continues to shape the realities of the Lakota people. The role of non-Native allies and solidarity. The struggles of the Lakota people have not gone unnoticed, and there have been many non-Native allies who have stood in solidarity with them. From the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 1970s to the Standing Rock protests, non-native activists and organizations have played a role in supporting the Lakota's fight for justice and self-determination. Solidarity from non-native allies has been important in raising awareness about the issues faced by the Lakota and other Native American tribes. It has also helped to build bridges between communities and foster a greater understanding of the historical and ongoing injustices faced by Indigenous peoples. However, the role of non-native allies is complex, and it is important for them to approach their support with humility and a willingness to listen to and follow the leadership of Native communities. True solidarity requires a commitment to addressing the root causes of injustice and working towards a more equitable and just society. The future of the Lakota people. The future of the Lakota people is shaped by their resilience, determination, and commitment to preserving their culture and sovereignty. Despite the immense challenges they have faced, the Lakota continue to fight for their rights and work towards a better future for their community. Efforts to revitalize the Lakota language, preserve cultural traditions, and address issues such as poverty and health disparities are critical to the future of the Lakota people. Education, activism, and community development are key areas of focus, as the Lakota seek to build a future that honors their past and empowers future generations. The ongoing struggles for justice, recognition, and self-determination are a testament to the strength and resilience of the Lakota people. Their story is one of survival, resistance, and hope, and it serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of standing up for justice and equality. The Wounded Knee Massacre was a pivotal moment in the history of the Lakota people, marking the end of armed resistance and the beginning of a new era of challenges and struggles. The long-term impacts of the massacre have been profound, shaping the cultural, social, political, and economic realities of the Lakota for generations. The trauma of Wounded Knee is intergenerational, passed down through stories, memories, and the ongoing struggles of the Lakota people. The loss of land, sovereignty, and cultural identity has had lasting effects, contributing to issues such as poverty, health disparities, and social challenges. However, the Lakota have shown remarkable resilience and determination in the face of these challenges. Efforts to revitalize the Lakota language, preserve cultural traditions, and address issues such as poverty and health disparities are critical to the future of the Lakota people. Education, activism, and community development are key areas of focus, as the Lakota seek to build a future that honors their past and empowers future generations. The story of the Lakota people is one of survival, resistance, and hope. It is a story that reminds us of the importance of standing up for justice and equality, and of the enduring strength of the human spirit. The long-term impacts of the Wounded Knee Massacre on the Lakota people are a testament to their resilience and determination, and they serve as a powerful reminder of the ongoing struggles faced by Indigenous peoples in the United States and around the world. The Battle of Wounded Knee and its influence on U.S. policies towards Native Americans. The Battle of Wounded Knee, which occurred on December 29, 1890, near Wounded Knee Creek on the Lakota Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota, stands as one of the most tragic and significant events in the history of Native American and U.S. relations. This confrontation between the U.S. Army and the Lakota Sioux marked the end of the Indian Wars and had profound implications for Native American communities and U.S. federal policies. The massacre at Wounded Knee not only resulted in the loss of hundreds of Native American lives but also symbolized the culmination of centuries of conflict, displacement, and cultural suppression. This article explores the historical context, the events leading up to the Battle of Wounded Knee, the massacre itself, and its lasting impact on U.S. policies towards Native Americans. Historical context: the Indian Wars and westward expansion. The Battle of Wounded Knee did not occur in isolation. It was the culmination of a long history of conflict between Native American tribes and the U.S. government. The Indian Wars, a series of conflicts that spanned from the early 17th century to the late 19th century, were driven by the U.S. government's desire to expand westward and acquire Native American lands. The doctrine of manifest destiny, which held that the expansion of the United States across the North American continent was both justified and inevitable, provided the ideological justification for the displacement and subjugation of Native American tribes. As settlers moved westward, they encroached on Native American territories, leading to numerous conflicts. The U.S. government sought to resolve these conflicts through treaties, many of which were broken or ignored when they conflicted with the interests of settlers or the government. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, for example, authorized the forced relocation of Native American tribes from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States to areas west of the Mississippi River, a journey known as the Trail of Tears. The reservation system. By the mid-19th century, the U.S. government had established a system of reservations, designated areas of land where Native American tribes were confined. The reservation system was intended to isolate Native Americans from settlers and assimilate them into Euro-American culture. However, the reservations were often located on marginal lands that were unsuitable for agriculture or hunting, leading to poverty and dependence on government rations. The Dawes Act of 1887, also known as the General Allotment Act, further disrupted Native American communities by dividing communal tribal lands into individual allotments. The act aimed to assimilate Native Americans by encouraging them to adopt European American farming practices and lifestyles. However, it resulted in the loss of millions of acres of Native American land, as surplus lands were sold to non-native settlers. The ghost dance movement. In the late 19th century, many Native American tribes were facing dire conditions on reservations. Poverty, disease, and the loss of traditional ways of life led to widespread despair. In this context, the ghost dance movement emerged among the Paiute people in Nevada and spread to other tribes, including the Lakota Sioux. The ghost dance was a spiritual movement that promised the restoration of Native American lands, the return of deceased ancestors, and the end of white domination. Participants believed that by performing the ghost dance, they could bring about a new world free from suffering and oppression. The movement alarmed U.S. authorities, who feared that it would incite rebellion among Native American tribes. The events leading to the Battle of Wounded Knee. The death of Sitting Bull, a prominent Lakota Sioux leader and spiritual figure, was seen as a symbol of resistance to U.S. expansion and assimilation policies. His involvement in the ghost dance movement made him a target for U.S. authorities. On December 15, 1890, Sitting Bull was arrested by Indian Agency police on the Standing Rock Reservation. During the arrest, a confrontation erupted, and Sitting Bull was shot and killed. Sitting Bull's death heightened tensions among the Lakota Sioux and increased fears of an uprising. Many Lakota, including those who had been followers of Sitting Bull, fled the Standing Rock Reservation and joined other bands of Lakota on the Pine Ridge Reservation. The surrender of Bigfoot's band. One of the groups that fled to Pine Ridge was led by Chief Bigfoot, Spotted Elk. Bigfoot's band, which included many women and children, was seeking refuge and hoped to avoid conflict with the U.S. Army. However, on December 28, 1890, they were intercepted by the 7th Cavalry Regiment near Wounded Knee Creek. Bigfoot, who was suffering from pneumonia, surrendered to the cavalry, and his band was escorted to a camp near Wounded Knee Creek. The following day, December 29, 1890, the U.S. Army attempted to disarm the Lakota. A scuffle broke out, and a shot was fired, leading to a violent confrontation. The massacre at Wounded Knee. The initial confrontation. The events of December 29, 1890, began with the U.S. Army's attempt to disarm Bigfoot's band. The soldiers surrounded the Lakota camp and demanded that the Native Americans surrender their weapons. Tensions were high, and the Lakota were reluctant to give up their arms, as they feared for their safety. During the disarmament process, a scuffle broke out between a soldier and a Lakota man. A shot was fired, and chaos ensued. The U.S. Army opened fire on the Lakota, including women and children, with rifles and Hotchkiss guns, which were rapid-fire cannons. The massacre at Wounded Knee was brutal and indiscriminate. The U.S. Army's firepower overwhelmed the Lakota, who were largely unarmed or armed only with traditional weapons. Many Lakota were shot as they tried to flee, while others were killed in close combat. The soldiers pursued those who attempted to escape, shooting them down as they ran. The exact number of casualties is disputed, but it is estimated that between 150 and 300 Lakota were killed, including many women and children. Some estimates suggest that as many as half of the dead were women and children. The U.S. Army also suffered casualties, with 25 soldiers killed, many of whom were likely hit by friendly fire. The aftermath. The massacre at Wounded Knee marked the end of the Indian Wars and the final suppression of Native American resistance to U.S. expansion. The event was widely reported in the press, and public opinion was divided. Some Americans celebrated the victory over the hostile Native Americans, while others were horrified by the brutality of the massacred. In the aftermath of Wounded Knee, the U.S. government continued its policies of assimilation and land dispossession. The ghost dance movement was effectively suppressed, and Native American tribes were further marginalized on reservations. The influence of Wounded Knee on U.S. policies towards Native Americans. The end of armed resistance. The Battle of Wounded Knee marked the end of large-scale armed resistance by Native American tribes against the U.S. government. The massacre demonstrated the overwhelming military power of the U.S. Army and the futility of further resistance. In the years following Wounded Knee, Native American tribes were increasingly confined to reservations, and their traditional ways of life were further eroded. The assimilation policy. The U.S. government's policy towards Native Americans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was dominated by the goal of assimilation. The Dawes Act of 1887, which had already begun the process of dividing tribal lands into individual allotments, was part of a broader effort to assimilate Native Americans into Euro-American society. The government sought to civilize Native Americans by encouraging them to adopt European American farming practices, Christianity, and the English language. The boarding school system was another key component of the assimilation policy. Native American children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to boarding schools, where they were forbidden to speak their native languages or practice their cultural traditions. The goal of these schools was to kill the Indian, save the man, as famously stated by Richard Henry Pratt, the founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. The impact on Native American communities. The policies of assimilation and land dispossession had devastating effects on Native American communities. The loss of tribal lands and the disruption of traditional ways of life led to widespread poverty, disease, and social disintegration. Native American populations declined sharply in the late 19th and early 20th centuries due to disease, malnutrition, and the loss of traditional food sources. The suppression of Native American religions and cultural practices further eroded tribal identities. The ghost dance movement, which had offered hope and spiritual renewal, was effectively crushed after Wounded Knee. Native American religions were banned, and traditional ceremonies, such as the sun dance, were outlawed. The shift towards reform in the early 20th century. There was a growing recognition of the failures of the assimilation policy and the need for reform. The Merriam Report of 1928, commissioned by the Institute for Government Research, documented the poor conditions on reservations and criticized the federal government's handling of Native American affairs. The report called for significant changes in federal policy, including improvements in education, health care, and economic development. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, also known as the Wheeler-Howard Act, marked a shift away from assimilation and towards greater self-determination for Native American tribes. The act ended the allotment of tribal lands and encouraged the reorganization of tribal governments. It also provided funding for economic development and education on reservations. The civil rights movement and Native American activism. The mid-20th century saw the rise of the civil rights movement, which had a significant impact on Native American activism. Native American leaders and organizations, such as the National Congress of American Indians, NCAI, and the American Indian Movement, AIM, emerged to advocate for the rights and sovereignty of Native American tribes. The occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973 by members of AIM was a direct response to the historical injustices faced by Native Americans, including the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890. The 1973 occupation, which lasted for 71 days, brought national attention to the issues of Native American rights and sovereignty. It also highlighted the ongoing struggles of Native American communities, including poverty, unemployment, and the loss of cultural heritage. The legacy of Wounded Knee. The Battle of Wounded Knee remains a powerful symbol of the injustices faced by Native Americans and the long history of conflict between Native American tribes and the U.S. government. The massacre is remembered as a tragic event that marked the end of Native American resistance to U.S. expansion and the beginning of a new era of federal policies aimed at assimilation and control. In recent years, there has been a growing recognition of the need to address the historical injustices faced by Native Americans and to support their efforts to preserve their cultures and sovereignty. The Wounded Knee Massacre is now commemorated as a reminder of the resilience and strength of Native American communities in the face of adversity. The Battle of Wounded Knee was a pivotal event in the history of U.S. Native American relations. It marked the end of the Indian Wars and the beginning of a new era of federal policies aimed at assimilation and control. The massacre had profound and lasting effects on Native American communities, leading to the loss of land, culture, and lives. In the years following Wounded Knee, the U.S. government continued its policies of assimilation and land dispossession, but there was also a growing recognition of the need for reform. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 and the rise of Native American activism in the mid-20th century marked important steps towards greater self-determination and sovereignty for Native American tribes. Today, the legacy of Wounded Knee serves as a reminder of the resilience and strength of Native American communities in the face of historical injustices. It also underscores the importance of addressing the ongoing challenges faced by Native Americans and supporting their efforts to preserve their cultures and sovereignty. The Battle of Wounded Knee remains a powerful symbol of the need for justice, reconciliation, and respect for the rights of Native American tribes. The U.S. government's fear of the ghost dance religion. A comprehensive analysis. The ghost dance religion, a spiritual movement that emerged among Native American tribes in the late 19th century, became a source of profound concern for the U.S. government. This movement, which promised the restoration of native lands, the return of deceased ancestors, and the end of white domination, was perceived as a significant threat to the established order. The U.S. government's fear of the ghost dance religion was rooted in a complex interplay of cultural, political, economic, and military factors. This article delves into the main reasons behind this fear, exploring the historical context, the beliefs and practices of the ghost dance, the government's response, and the broader implications of this episode in American history. Historical context. The plight of Native Americans in the late 19th century. To understand the U.S. government's fear of the ghost dance religion, it is essential to first examine the historical context in which this movement arose. By the late 19th century, Native American tribes had endured decades of displacement, warfare, and cultural suppression. The U.S. government's policy of westward expansion, driven by the doctrine of manifest destiny, had resulted in the forced removal of Native peoples from their ancestral lands. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, the Trail of Tears, and the series of Indian Wars were all part of a broader effort to consolidate control over the continent. The reservation system, established in the mid-19th century, further marginalized Native Americans. Reservations were often located on undesirable land, and the federal government's promises of support and protection were frequently broken. Native peoples faced poverty, disease, and starvation, as their traditional ways of life were systematically dismantled. The Dawes Act of 1887, which aimed to assimilate Native Americans by allotting individual plots of land and encouraging agriculture, further eroded tribal cohesion and cultural practices. The rise of the ghost dance movement. Amidst this backdrop of suffering and despair, the ghost dance religion emerged as a beacon of hope for many Native Americans. The movement was founded by Wovoka, a Paiute prophet, who experienced a vision during a solar eclipse in 1889. Wovoka preached a message of peace, unity, and renewal, urging Native peoples to live righteously and perform the ghost dance, a ritual that would hasten the arrival of a new era. According to Wovoka's teachings, the earth would be renewed, the buffalo would return, and the ancestors would come back to life. Most importantly, the white settlers would disappear, and Native Americans would regain their lands and sovereignty. The ghost dance quickly spread among various tribes, including the Lakota Sioux, who became some of the most fervent adherents. The movement's emphasis on nonviolence and spiritual renewal resonated deeply with Native Americans who had suffered immense losses and were searching for a way to reclaim their dignity and way of life. The U.S. government's fear of the ghost dance misinterpretation and misunderstanding. One of the primary reasons for the U.S. government's fear of the ghost dance religion was a fundamental misunderstanding of its nature and intent. Government officials and military leaders often misinterpreted the ghost dance as a militant and revolutionary movement. They believed that the ritualistic dancing and the promise of the return of the ancestors were preparations for an armed uprising against white settlers and the U.S. government. This misinterpretation was fueled by a lack of cultural understanding and a tendency to view Native American spiritual practices through a lens of suspicion and fear. The government's agents, many of whom were unfamiliar with Native American cultures, failed to grasp the peaceful and redemptive aspects of the ghost dance. Instead, they saw it as a threat to the established order and a potential catalyst for widespread rebellion. The role of the media played a significant role in amplifying the government's fears. Sensationalist newspapers and magazines of the time often portrayed the ghost dance as a dangerous and fanatical movement. Headlines warned of an impending Indian uprising, and stories exaggerated the potential for violence. This media coverage created a climate of hysteria and paranoia, leading to calls for swift and decisive action to suppress the ghost dance. The media's portrayal of the ghost dance was often shaped by racial stereotypes and a deep-seated fear of Native Americans. The idea that Native peoples could unite under a common spiritual movement and challenge white dominance was deeply unsettling to many Americans. The media's sensationalism not only influenced public opinion but also pressured the government to take aggressive measures to quell the perceived threat. Military concerns. The U.S. military, which had been engaged in a series of conflicts with Native American tribes throughout the 19th century, viewed the ghost dance as a potential catalyst for renewed hostilities. The military's experience in the Indian Wars had taught them that Native American resistance could be formidable, and they were wary of any movement that could unite different tribes against the U.S. government. The military's concerns were particularly acute in the case of the Lakota Sioux, who had a history of armed resistance. The ghost dance's rapid spread among the Lakota raised fears that they might use the movement as a pretext for launching attacks on white settlers or military outposts. The military's apprehension was further heightened by reports of increased ghost dance activity and the gathering of large groups of Native Americans at dance sites. Political and economic interests. The U.S. government's fear of the ghost dance was also driven by political and economic interests. The late 19th century was a period of rapid industrialization and westward expansion, and the government was eager to open up Native American lands for settlement, resource extraction, and railroad construction. The ghost dance's promise of the restoration of native lands and the disappearance of white settlers posed a direct challenge to these ambitions. Politically, the government was under pressure from settlers, business interests, and politicians who advocated for the removal of Native Americans from their lands. The ghost dance movement, with its potential to unite tribes and resist further encroachment, was seen as an obstacle to the government's plans for westward expansion. The fear of losing control over native lands and the economic opportunities they represented was a significant factor in the government's determination to suppress the ghost dance. The role of Indian agents and missionaries. Indian agents and Christian missionaries also played a role in stoking the government's fears. Indian agents, who were responsible for overseeing reservations and implementing government policies, often viewed Native American spiritual practices as a threat to their authority. They saw the ghost dance as a challenge to their efforts to assimilate Native Americans into white society and convert them to Christianity. Missionaries, who were actively working to convert Native Americans to Christianity, viewed the ghost dance as a competing religious movement that could undermine their efforts. They often portrayed the ghost dance as a form of paganism or devil worship, further fueling the government's fears. Reports from Indian agents and missionaries, which emphasized the potential for violence and resistance, contributed to the government's perception of the ghost dance as a dangerous and subversive movement. The Wounded Knee Massacre. The culmination of the U.S. government's fear of the ghost dance was the Wounded Knee Massacre of December 29, 1890. The massacre, which occurred on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, marked a tragic and violent end to the ghost dance movement. The U.S. Army's 7th Cavalry Regiment, which had been dispatched to suppress the ghost dance, surrounded a group of Lakota Sioux who were attempting to surrender. A confrontation ensued, and the soldiers opened fire, killing an estimated 150 to 300 Native Americans, including women and children. The Wounded Knee Massacre was a direct result of the government's fear and misunderstanding of the ghost dance. The military's aggressive response, driven by the belief that the ghost dance posed a serious threat, led to a horrific loss of life and the effective end of the movement. The massacre also served as a stark reminder of the government's willingness to use extreme violence to maintain control over Native Americans and suppress any form of resistance. Broader implications. The legacy of the ghost dance movement and the U.S. government's response to it had profound and lasting implications for Native American communities. The massacre at Wounded Knee was a devastating blow to the Lakota Sioux and other tribes who had embraced the ghost dance. It marked the end of a spiritual movement that had offered hope and renewal in the face of overwhelming adversity. The legacy of the ghost dance also highlights the deep-seated fear and mistrust that characterized the relationship between the U.S. government and Native Americans. The government's willingness to use violence to suppress the ghost dance demonstrated its determination to maintain control over Native lands and peoples, even at the cost of immense suffering and loss of life. The impact on Native American resistance. The suppression of the ghost dance did not end Native American resistance to U.S. government policies. While the massacre at Wounded Knee marked the end of large-scale armed resistance, Native Americans continued to fight for their rights and sovereignty through other means. The early 20th century saw the rise of Native American political organizations, such as the Society of American Indians, which advocated for civil rights, land claims, and cultural preservation. The ghost dance movement also left a lasting legacy of spiritual resilience and cultural pride. Despite the government's efforts to suppress Native American spiritual practices, many tribes continued to preserve and revitalize their traditions. The ghost dance, as a symbol of hope and resistance, remains an important part of Native American history and identity. The role of cultural misunderstanding. The U.S. government's fear of the ghost dance underscores the dangers of cultural misunderstanding and the consequences of viewing other cultures through a lens of fear and suspicion. The government's inability to comprehend the peaceful and redemptive aspects of the ghost dance led to a tragic overreaction and the loss of countless lives. This episode in American history serves as a reminder of the importance of cultural sensitivity and the need to approach other cultures with an open mind and a willingness to understand. The ghost dance movement, with its message of peace and renewal, offers valuable lessons for contemporary society as we grapple with issues of cultural diversity, religious freedom, and social justice. The ghost dance in contemporary context. In contemporary times, the ghost dance has taken on new significance as a symbol of Native American resilience and the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. The movement's emphasis on spiritual renewal and the restoration of native lands resonates with modern efforts to address historical injustices and promote Indigenous rights. The ghost dance also serves as a powerful reminder of the need to confront and reckon with the darker chapters of American history. The Wounded Knee Massacre, as a tragic example of the government's willingness to use violence to suppress dissent, continues to be a source of reflection and remembrance for Native Americans and all those who seek to promote peace and justice. The U.S. government's fear of the ghost dance religion was driven by a complex interplay of cultural, political, economic, and military factors. Misinterpretation and misunderstanding of the movement's peaceful and redemptive nature, combined with the media's sensationalism and the military's concerns, led to a tragic overreaction. The Wounded Knee Massacre, as the culmination of this fear, marked a devastating end to the ghost dance movement and left a lasting legacy of pain and loss for Native American communities. The ghost dance movement, with its message of hope and renewal, remains an important part of Native American history and identity. It serves as a reminder of the resilience and strength of Native peoples in the face of overwhelming adversity. The lessons of the ghost dance, particularly the dangers of cultural misunderstanding and the importance of cultural sensitivity, continue to resonate in contemporary society as we strive to build a more just and inclusive world. In reflecting on the U.S. government's fear of the ghost dance, we are reminded of the need to confront and reckon with the darker chapters of our history. By understanding and acknowledging the past, we can work towards a future that honors the dignity and rights of all peoples, and that seeks to build bridges of understanding and respect across cultural divides. The ghost dance, as a symbol of hope and resistance, offers a powerful reminder of the enduring spirit of Native American communities and the importance of preserving and celebrating their rich cultural heritage. The media and public opinion reaction to the Battle of Wounded Knee. A comprehensive analysis. The Battle of Wounded Knee, which occurred on December 29, 1890, near Wounded Knee Creek on the Lakota Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota, stands as one of the most tragic and controversial events in American history. Often referred to as the Wounded Knee Massacre, the confrontation between the U.S. Army and the Lakota Sioux resulted in the deaths of approximately 150 to 300 Native Americans, including women and children, and 25 U.S. soldiers. The event marked a devastating end to the Indian Wars and had profound implications for Native American communities, U.S. policy, and the broader American consciousness. This article delves into the media coverage and public opinion surrounding the Battle of Wounded Knee at the time of its occurrence. It explores how newspapers, magazines, and other forms of media portrayed the event, how public opinion was shaped by these portrayals, and the broader cultural and political context in which these reactions took place. By examining contemporary accounts, editorials, and public responses, we can gain a deeper understanding of how the Battle of Wounded Knee was perceived in its historical moment and how those perceptions have evolved over time. Historical context: the Indian Wars and the Ghost Dance movement. To understand the media and public reaction to the Battle of Wounded Knee, it is essential to situate the event within the broader context of the Indian Wars and the Ghost Dance movement. The Indian Wars were a series of conflicts between the U.S. government and various Native American tribes that spanned the 19th century. These conflicts were driven by the U.S. government's policy of westward expansion, which often involved the forced removal of Native Americans from their ancestral lands. The Ghost Dance movement, which emerged in the late 1880s, was a spiritual revival among Native Americans that promised the restoration of their traditional way of life, the return of the buffalo, and the departure of white settlers. The movement was particularly strong among the Lakota Sioux, who had suffered greatly from the loss of their land, the depletion of the buffalo, and the imposition of reservation life. The U.S. government viewed the ghost dance as a threat to its authority and feared that it could incite a widespread uprising. This fear led to the deployment of the U.S. Army to the Lakota reservations, culminating in the tragic events at Wounded Knee. The lead-up to Wounded Knee. In the months leading up to the Battle of Wounded Knee, tensions between the Lakota Sioux and the U.S. government were high. The Lakota were increasingly desperate as they faced starvation, disease, and the loss of their traditional way of life. The ghost dance offered them hope, but it also made them a target of suspicion and feared. In December 1890, the U.S. Army was dispatched to the Pine Ridge Reservation to suppress the ghost dance and arrest its leaders. On December 28, a detachment of the 7th Cavalry Regiment intercepted a group of Lakota, led by Chief Spotted Elk, also known as Bigfoot, who were traveling to Pine Ridge. The Lakota were disarmed and taken to a camp near Wounded Knee Creek. The following day, a confrontation broke out when the soldiers attempted to disarm the Lakota completely. A shot was fired, and the situation quickly escalated into a massacre. The U.S. Army opened fire with Hotchkiss guns, killing men, women, and children indiscriminately. The exact number of casualties is disputed, but it is estimated that between 150 and 300 Lakota were killed, along with 25 U.S. soldiers, many of whom were likely killed by friendly fire. Media coverage of the Battle of Wounded Knee. The role of the press in the late 19th century. In the late 19th century, the press played a crucial role in shaping public opinion and influencing government policy. Newspapers were the primary source of information for most Americans, and they often reflected the biases and interests of their owners and editors. The rise of yellow journalism, characterized by sensationalism and a focus on scandal and crime, further influenced how events were reported. The Battle of Wounded Knee occurred at a time when the press was becoming increasingly powerful and influential. The event was covered extensively by newspapers across the country, and the way it was portrayed had a significant impact on public perception. Initial reports, confusion and sensationalism. The initial reports of the Battle of Wounded Knee were marked by confusion and sensationalism. Many newspapers relied on telegraph dispatches from the scene, which were often incomplete or inaccurate. The first reports described the event as a battle rather than a massacre, emphasizing the bravery of the U.S. soldiers and downplaying the extent of the violence against the Lakota. For example, the New York Times published a headline on December 30, 1890, that read, "Fierce Fight with Sioux, a Bloody Battle with Bigfoot's Band." The article described the event as a desperate fight and focused on the heroism of the 7th Cavalry, with little mention of the Lakota casualties. This framing was typical of many initial reports, which portrayed the U.S. Army as the victim of a surprise attack by hostile Indians. The role of embedded journalists. One of the reasons for the initial confusion and bias in the reporting was the presence of embedded journalists with the U.S. Army. These journalists relied on the military for access to the front lines and were often sympathetic to the soldiers' perspective. Their reports tended to emphasize the danger faced by the troops and the necessity of their actions. For example, Charles W. Allen, a reporter for the Chadron Democrat, was embedded with the 7th Cavalry and witnessed the massacre firsthand. His initial reports were sympathetic to the soldiers, but he later wrote more critically about the event, describing it as a massacre rather than a battle. However, his more critical accounts were not widely circulated at the time. The emergence of critical voices as more information became available, some newspapers began to publish more critical accounts of the event. These reports highlighted the disproportionate use of force by the U.S. Army and the high number of civilian casualties. However, these critical voices were often drowned out by the dominant narrative that portrayed the event as a necessary and justified action against a hostile enemy. For example, the Omaha Daily Bee published an article on January 1, 1891, that described the event as a massacre and criticized the U.S. Army for its handling of the situation. The article stated, "The killing of the women and children was a needless and cruel slaughter." However, such critical accounts were the exception rather than the rule. The role of visual media. In addition to written reports, visual media also played a role in shaping public perception of the Battle of Wounded Knee. Photographs of the aftermath of the massacre were taken by individuals such as George E. Traeger, a photographer who accompanied the U.S. Army. These images depicted the frozen bodies of Lakota men, women, and children lying in the snow, and they were widely circulated in newspapers and magazines. The graphic nature of these images had a profound impact on public opinion. They provided undeniable evidence of the brutality of the massacre and challenged the initial narrative that portrayed the event as a heroic battle. However, the images were often accompanied by captions that reinforced the dominant narrative, emphasizing the savagery of the Lakota and the necessity of the U.S. Army's actions. The role of editorial commentary. Editorial commentary in newspapers and magazines also played a significant role in shaping public opinion. Many editorials defended the actions of the U.S. Army and portrayed the massacre as a necessary step in the civilizing of the West. These editorials often reflected the prevailing attitudes of the time, which viewed Native Americans as obstacles to progress and civilization. For example, an editorial in the Chicago Tribune on January 1, 1891, stated, "The Indian must be taught that he cannot defy the authority of the United States." The lesson at Wounded Knee was a severe one, but it was necessary. This type of commentary reinforced the idea that the massacre was justified and necessary for the advancement of American civilization. However, there were also editorials that criticized the U.S. Army's actions and called for a more humane treatment of Native Americans. For example, an editorial in The Nation on January 8, 1891, stated, "The slaughter of the Indians at Wounded Knee was a disgrace to the American name. It was not a battle, but a massacre of unarmed men, women, and children." These critical voices, though in the minority, provided an important counter-narrative to the dominant discourse. The role of political cartoons. Political cartoons were another important medium through which public opinion was shaped. Cartoons often used satire and exaggeration to make a point, and they were widely circulated in newspapers and magazines. Many cartoons about the Battle of Wounded Knee reflected the prevailing attitudes of the time, portraying Native Americans as savages and the U.S. Army as heroes. For example, a cartoon published in Puck magazine on January 14, 1891, depicted a Native American as a wild beast being subdued by a U.S. soldier. The caption read, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian," a phrase that was commonly used at the time to justify the extermination of Native Americans. This type of imagery reinforced the idea that the massacre was a necessary and justified action. However, there were also cartoons that criticized the U.S. Army's actions and portrayed the massacre as a tragic and unnecessary event. For example, a cartoon published in The Judge on January 17, 1891, depicted a U.S. soldier standing over the bodies of Native American women and children, with the caption, "Is this civilization?" This type of imagery challenged the dominant narrative and called into question the morality of the U.S. government's treatment of Native Americans. Public opinion and reaction. The dominant narrative, justification and celebration. In the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Wounded Knee, public opinion was largely shaped by the dominant narrative that portrayed the event as a necessary and justified action against a hostile enemy. Many Americans viewed the massacre as a victory for civilization and progress, and they celebrated the bravery of the U.S. soldiers. This sentiment was reflected in the public celebrations that took place in many towns and cities across the country. For example, in Chatron, Nebraska, a town near the Pine Ridge Reservation, a parade was held to celebrate the victory at Wounded Knee. The parade featured a float depicting the U.S. Army's triumph over the savage Indians, and it was attended by hundreds of people. The dominant narrative was also reinforced by the speeches and statements of political leaders. For example, Senator John M. Thurston of Nebraska gave a speech in Congress in which he praised the U.S. Army for its actions at Wounded Knee. He stated, "The Indian must be taught that he cannot defy the authority of the United States." The lesson at Wounded Knee was a severe one, but it was necessary. This type of rhetoric reinforced the idea that the massacre was justified and necessary for the advancement of American civilization. The emergence of dissenting voices. Despite the dominant narrative, there were also dissenting voices that criticized the U.S. Army's actions and called for a more humane treatment of Native Americans. These voices were often marginalized, but they provided an important counter-narrative to the dominant discourse. For example, Helen Hunt Jackson, a writer and activist, published a series of articles in the Century magazine in which she criticized the U.S. government's treatment of Native Americans. She described the massacre at Wounded Knee as a crime against humanity and called for justice for the victims. Her articles were widely read and helped to raise awareness of the plight of Native Americans. Similarly, the Indian Rights Association, a reform organization founded in 1882, issued a statement condemning the massacre at Wounded Knee. The statement called for an investigation into the event and for the U.S. government to take responsibility for its actions. The association also called for reforms to U.S. Indian policy, including the protection of Native American rights and the promotion of their welfare. The role of religious and humanitarian groups. Religious and humanitarian groups also played a role in shaping public opinion about the Battle of Wounded Knee. Many of these groups were critical of the U.S. government's treatment of Native Americans and called for a more compassionate and just approach. For example, the Women's National Indian Association, founded in 1879, was a prominent advocate for Native American rights. The association issued a statement condemning the massacre at Wounded Knee and calling for an end to the violence against Native Americans. The statement read, "The massacre at Wounded Knee is a stain on the honor of our nation. We call upon the government to take immediate action to protect the rights and lives of the Native American people." Similarly, the Quakers, who had a long history of advocating for Native American rights, issued a statement condemning the massacre and calling for reforms to U.S. Indian policy. The statement read, "The Quakers stand in solidarity with the Native American people and call upon the government to end the violence and injustice that has been perpetrated against them." The impact on Native American communities. The massacre at Wounded Knee had a profound impact on Native American communities, both in the immediate aftermath and in the years that followed. The event was a traumatic and devastating blow to the Lakota Sioux, who had already suffered greatly from the loss of their land, the depletion of the buffalo, and the imposition of reservation life. In the immediate aftermath of the massacre, many Lakota fled the Pine Ridge Reservation, fearing further violence from the U.S. Army. Some sought refuge in Canada, while others went into hiding in the surrounding hills. The massacre also had a lasting psychological impact on the Lakota, who viewed it as a betrayal by the U.S. government and a violation of their trust. The massacre also had a broader impact on Native American communities across the country. It served as a stark reminder of the violence and injustice that Native Americans had endured at the hands of the U.S. government, and it galvanized many Native Americans to resist further encroachments on their rights and land. The role of the U.S. government. The U.S. government's response to the Battle of Wounded Knee was marked by a combination of denial, justification, and attempts to downplay the severity of the event. In the immediate aftermath of the massacre, the government sought to portray the event as a necessary and justified action against a hostile enemy. For example, General Nelson A. Miles, who was in command of the U.S. Army in the region, issued a statement in which he praised the soldiers for their bravery and described the event as a battle rather than a massacre. He stated, "The soldiers acted with great courage and determination in the face of a hostile enemy." The action at Wounded Knee was a necessary and justified response to the threat posed by the Sioux. However, there were also voices within the government that were critical of the U.S. Army's actions. For example, Senator Henry L. Dawes of Massachusetts, who was a member of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, called for an investigation into the massacre. He stated, "The events at Wounded Knee raise serious questions about the conduct of the U.S. Army and the treatment of Native Americans. We must ensure that such a tragedy does not happen again." Despite these calls for an investigation, no formal inquiry was ever conducted, and no one was held accountable for the massacre. The U.S. government continued to pursue its policy of westward expansion and the forced assimilation of Native Americans, with little regard for their rights or well-being. The legacy of Wounded Knee. The long-term impact on Native American communities. The massacre at Wounded Knee had a lasting impact on Native American communities, both in terms of their relationship with the U.S. government and their own sense of identity and resilience. The event became a symbol of the violence and injustice that Native Americans had endured, and it served as a rallying cry for future generations of Native American activists and leaders. In the years following the massacre, many Native American communities sought to preserve the memory of Wounded Knee and to honor the victims. For example, in 1891, a group of Lakota survivors erected a monument at the site of the massacre to commemorate the lives that were lost. The monument, which still stands today, serves as a reminder of the tragedy and a symbol of the resilience of the Lakota people. The massacre also had a profound impact on the broader Native American rights movement. It galvanized many Native Americans to resist further encroachments on their rights and land, and it inspired a new generation of activists and leaders who sought to challenge the U.S. government's policies and to advocate for the rights and well-being of Native Americans. The role of Wounded Knee in American memory. The Battle of Wounded Knee has occupied a complex and contested place in American memory. For many years, the event was largely forgotten or downplayed in mainstream American history, overshadowed by other events such as the Civil War and the settlement of the West. However, in recent decades, there has been a growing recognition of the significance of Wounded Knee and its impact on Native American communities. In the 1970s, the American Indian Movement, AIM, brought renewed attention to the massacre at Wounded Knee through a series of protests and occupations. In 1973, AIM activists occupied the town of Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation, demanding justice for the victims of the massacre and calling for an end to the U.S. government's mistreatment of Native Americans. The occupation lasted for 71 days and brought national and international attention to the ongoing struggles of Native American communities. The occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973 also led to a re-evaluation of the historical significance of the massacre. Many historians and activists began to view Wounded Knee not just as a tragic event in the past, but as a symbol of the ongoing struggles of Native Americans for justice, sovereignty, and self-determination. The role of media in shaping the legacy of Wounded Knee. The media has played a crucial role in shaping the legacy of Wounded Knee, both at the time of the massacre and in the years that followed. In the immediate aftermath of the event, the media largely reinforced the dominant narrative that portrayed the massacre as a necessary and justified action against a hostile enemy. However, as more information became available and as public attitudes began to shift, the media also played a role in challenging this narrative and in bringing attention to the injustices that had been committed. In recent decades, the media has continued to play a role in shaping the legacy of Wounded Knee. Documentaries, films, and books have brought renewed attention to the massacre and its impact on Native American communities. For example, the 1992 film Thunderheart, directed by Michael Apted, explores the legacy of Wounded Knee and the ongoing struggles of Native Americans for justice and sovereignty. Similarly, the 2007 documentary Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, based on the book by Dee Brown, provides a powerful and moving account of the massacre and its impact on Native American communities. The role of education and public memory. Education and public memory have also played a crucial role in shaping the legacy of Wounded Knee. For many years, the massacre was largely absent from mainstream American history textbooks, and it was rarely taught in schools. However, in recent decades, there has been a growing recognition of the importance of including Wounded Knee in the curriculum and of teaching students about the history and experiences of Native Americans. In 1990, on the 100th anniversary of the massacre, the U.S. Congress passed a resolution acknowledging the tragedy of Wounded Knee and expressing regret for the actions of the U.S. government. The resolution stated, "The Congress recognizes the historical significance of the Wounded Knee massacre and expresses its deep regret for the tragic events that occurred there." This resolution was an important step in acknowledging the significance of Wounded Knee and in promoting a more inclusive and accurate understanding of American history. The role of commemoration and memorialization have also played a crucial role in shaping the legacy of Wounded Knee. In addition to the monument erected by Lakota survivors in 1891, there have been numerous other efforts to commemorate the victims of the massacre and to honor their memory. For example, in 1990, on the 100th anniversary of the massacre, a group of Lakota riders retraced the route taken by Chief Spotted Elk and his band to Wounded Knee. The ride, known as the Bigfoot Memorial Ride, was a powerful and moving tribute to the victims of the massacre and a reminder of the resilience and strength of the Lakota people. Similarly, in 2013, the Wounded Knee Massacre site was designated as a National Historic Landmark, recognizing its significance in American history and its importance to Native American communities. The designation was an important step in preserving the memory of Wounded Knee and in ensuring that future generations would remember the tragedy and its impact. The Battle of Wounded Knee was a tragic and devastating event that had a profound impact on Native American communities, U.S. policy, and the broader American consciousness. The media coverage and public opinion surrounding the event at the time were shaped by a combination of sensationalism, bias, and the prevailing attitudes of the era. While the dominant narrative portrayed the massacre as a necessary and justified action against a hostile enemy, there were also dissenting voices that criticized the U.S. Army's actions and called for a more humane treatment of Native Americans. In the years that followed, the legacy of Wounded Knee has been shaped by a combination of commemoration, education, and activism. The event has become a symbol of the violence and injustice that Native Americans have endured, and it has served as a rallying cry for future generations of Native American activists and leaders. The media, education, and public memory have all played a crucial role in shaping the legacy of Wounded Knee, and they continue to do so today. As we reflect on the events of Wounded Knee and their impact, it is important to remember the victims and to honor their memory. It is also important to recognize the ongoing struggles of Native American communities for justice, sovereignty, and self-determination. By doing so, we can ensure that the lessons of Wounded Knee are not forgotten and that we continue to work towards a more just and equitable future for all. The role of the 7th Cavalry Regiment in the Battle of Wounded Knee. The Battle of Wounded Knee, often referred to as the Wounded Knee Massacre, stands as one of the most tragic and controversial events in American history. Occurring on December 29, 1890, near Wounded Knee Creek on the Lakota Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota, the battle marked a brutal end to the Indian Wars and a devastating blow to the Native American resistance against U.S. expansion. At the heart of this tragic event was the 7th Cavalry Regiment, a unit of the United States Army with a storied history that included both heroic and infamous moments. This article delves into the role of the 7th Cavalry Regiment in the Battle of Wounded Knee, examining the historical context, the events leading up to the massacre, the actions of the 7th Cavalry during the battle, and the aftermath that continues to resonate today. Historical context. The Indian Wars and U.S. expansion. The late 19th century was a period of intense conflict between the United States government and Native American tribes. As the U.S. expanded westward, the federal government sought to acquire native lands, often through treaties that were later broken or through outright military force. The Indian Wars, a series of conflicts between the U.S. Army and various Native American tribes, were characterized by a series of battles, skirmishes, and massacres. The Lakota Sioux, a powerful and proud nation, were among the most resistant to U.S. encroachment. The Great Sioux War of 1876–77, which included the famous Battle of the Little Bighorn, was a significant conflict in which the Lakota and their allies achieved a major victory against the U.S. Army. However, the U.S. government's determination to subdue the native tribes and force them onto reservations ultimately led to the decline of native resistance. The Ghost Dance movement. In the late 1880s, a new religious movement known as the Ghost Dance emerged among the Native American tribes. The Ghost Dance was a spiritual movement that promised the return of the buffalo, the resurrection of deceased ancestors, and the restoration of native lands. The movement spread rapidly among the Lakota Sioux, who were suffering from the loss of their traditional way of life, the depletion of the buffalo herds, and the harsh conditions on the reservations. The U.S. government viewed the Ghost Dance as a threat to their authority and feared that it would incite rebellion among the native tribes. In response, the government sought to suppress the movement, leading to increased tensions and ultimately to the events at Wounded Knee. The 7th Cavalry Regiment. The 7th Cavalry Regiment was established in 1866 and quickly became one of the most famous units in the U.S. Army. The regiment gained notoriety under the command of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, who led the 7th Cavalry to both glory and infamy. The regiment's most famous engagement was the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, where Custer and his men were defeated by a coalition of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. Despite this defeat, the 7th Cavalry continued to play a significant role in the Indian Wars. By the time of the Wounded Knee Massacre, the regiment was under the command of Colonel James W. Forsyth, a veteran officer with experience in the Civil War and the Indian Wars. The road to Wounded Knee. The arrest of Sitting Bull in December 1890, the U.S. government became increasingly concerned about the ghost dance movement and the potential for an uprising among the Lakota Sioux. The government ordered the arrest of several prominent Native leaders, including Sitting Bull, a respected Hunkpapa Lakota leader who had been a key figure in the resistance against U.S. expansion. On December 15, 1890, a group of Indian police officers attempted to arrest Sitting Bull at his home on the Standing Rock Reservation. The arrest quickly turned violent, and Sitting Bull was killed in the ensuing confrontation. His death further inflamed tensions among the Lakota and increased fears of a widespread rebellion. The flight of Bigfoot's band. Following the death of Sitting Bull, many of his followers fled the Standing Rock Reservation and joined the Minneconjou Lakota chief Bigfoot. Bigfoot's band, which included women, children, and elderly members, sought refuge at the Pine Ridge Reservation, where they hoped to find safety and support from other Lakota leaders. However, the U.S. Army viewed Bigfoot's band as a potential threat and ordered their arrest. On December 28, 1890, the 7th Cavalry Regiment intercepted Bigfoot's band near Wounded Knee Creek. The band, which was already suffering from illness and exhaustion, surrendered without resistance and was escorted to a campsite near Wounded Knee Creek. The Battle of Wounded Knee. The morning of December 29, 1890. On the morning of December 29, 1890, the 7th Cavalry Regiment, under the command of Colonel James W. Forsyth, surrounded Bigfoot's camp. The soldiers were heavily armed and outnumbered the Native Americans, who were mostly unarmed and included many women and children. The soldiers began to disarm the Lakota, searching for weapons and confiscating any they found. Tensions were high, and the atmosphere was charged with fear and mistrust. The Lakota, who had already surrendered and were under the control of the soldiers, were understandably anxious and fearful of what might happen next. The spark that ignited the massacre. The exact sequence of events that led to the massacre is still a matter of debate, but it is generally agreed that a single shot fired by a Lakota man named Black Coyote sparked the violence. Black Coyote, who was deaf, was reluctant to give up his rifle, and in the struggle that ensued, the weapon discharged. The soldiers, already on edge and fearing an attack, immediately opened fire on the Lakota. The initial volley was followed by a sustained barrage of gunfire from the soldiers, who used their rifles, Hotchkiss guns, light artillery, and other weapons to mow down the Native Americans. The massacre that followed was brutal and indiscriminate. The soldiers, many of whom were veterans of the Indian Wars and harbored deep-seated animosity towards the Native Americans, showed little mercy. They fired into the crowd of Lakota, killing men, women, and children alike. Some of the Lakota attempted to flee, but they were pursued and shot down by the soldiers. The Hotchkiss guns, which had been positioned on a hill overlooking the camp, rained down explosive shells on the fleeing Lakota, causing further carnage. The soldiers also used their rifles to shoot at close range, often killing unarmed and defenseless individuals. The massacre lasted for less than an hour, but by the time the shooting stopped, between 150 and 300 Lakota had been killed, including Bigfoot. Many of the dead were women and children, and some of the bodies were found several miles from the camp, indicating that they had been pursued and killed as they tried to escape. The aftermath of the massacre. The immediate aftermath of the massacre was chaotic and gruesome. The soldiers, many of whom were wounded or in shock, began to round up the survivors and tend to their own wounded. The Lakota survivors, many of whom were injured and traumatized, were herded together and taken to a nearby church, where they were given minimal medical care. The dead were left where they fell, and it was not until several days later that a burial party was organized to inter the bodies. The frozen ground made it difficult to dig graves, and many of the bodies were simply piled into a mass grave. The massacre at Wounded Knee was widely reported in the press, and it sparked outrage and condemnation from many quarters. However, the U.S. government and the Army defended the actions of the 7th Cavalry, claiming that the soldiers had acted in self-defense and that the Lakota had been planning an uprising. The role of the 7th Cavalry Regiment. The 7th Cavalry's motivation and mindset. The 7th Cavalry Regiment's actions at Wounded Knee cannot be understood without considering the broader context of the Indian Wars and the regiment's own history. The 7th Cavalry had a reputation for being a tough and disciplined unit, but it also carried the legacy of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, where Custer and his men had been defeated by the Lakota and their allies. For many of the soldiers in the 7th Cavalry, the memory of the Little Bighorn was still fresh, and there was a desire for revenge against the Lakota. This desire for revenge, combined with the prevailing attitudes of the time towards Native Americans, contributed to the brutality of the massacre. The soldiers of the 7th Cavalry were also influenced by the broader cultural and racial attitudes of the late 19th century. Native Americans were often depicted as savages and obstacles to progress, and many soldiers viewed them as less than human. This dehumanization made it easier for the soldiers to justify their actions and to see the massacre as a necessary and even righteous act. The command of Colonel James W. Forsyth. Colonel James W. Forsyth, the commander of the 7th Cavalry at Wounded Knee, played a crucial role in the events of that day. Forsyth was a seasoned officer with experience in the Civil War and the Indian Wars, but his leadership at Wounded Knee has been widely criticized. Forsyth's decision to disarm the Lakota and to position the Hotchkiss guns overlooking the camp was a key factor in the escalation of tensions that led to the massacre. His handling of the situation has been described as heavy-handed and reckless, and many have argued that he failed to take adequate precautions to prevent violence. After the massacre, Forsyth was initially relieved of his command and faced an official investigation. However, he was later exonerated and reinstated, and he went on to have a successful military career. The exoneration of Forsyth and the lack of accountability for the massacre have been sources of controversy and criticism. The soldiers' actions and accountability. The actions of the individual soldiers of the 7th Cavalry at Wounded Knee have also been the subject of scrutiny and debate. Many of the soldiers were young and inexperienced, and they were operating in a highly stressful and volatile environment. However, the indiscriminate and brutal nature of the massacre suggests that many of the soldiers acted with a level of cruelty and disregard for human life that cannot be excused. The lack of accountability for the soldiers involved in the massacre has been a source of ongoing controversy. While some soldiers were initially investigated and even court-martialed, none were ultimately held responsible for the deaths of the Lakota. This lack of accountability has contributed to the perception that the massacre was not only a tragic event but also a grave injustice. The aftermath and legacy of Wounded Knee. The immediate aftermath. In the immediate aftermath of the massacre, the U.S. government and the Army sought to downplay the severity of the event and to justify the actions of the 7th Cavalry. The official narrative portrayed the massacre as a necessary and justified response to a potential uprising, and the soldiers were hailed as heroes for their actions. However, the reality of the massacre could not be hidden, and reports from journalists and eyewitnesses began to circulate, revealing the true extent of the violence and the indiscriminate killing of women and children. The massacre sparked outrage and condemnation from many quarters, including from some within the U.S. government and the military. The impact on the Lakota Sioux. The massacre at Wounded Knee had a devastating impact on the Lakota Sioux and other Native American tribes. The loss of life was immense, and the trauma of the massacre reverberated through the Lakota community for generations. The massacre also marked the end of the Ghost Dance movement and the final defeat of the Lakota resistance to U.S. expansion. For many Lakota, Wounded Knee became a symbol of the injustices and atrocities committed against Native Americans by the U.S. government and the Army. The massacre is remembered as a dark chapter in the history of the Lakota and as a reminder of the ongoing struggle for Native American rights and sovereignty. The long-term legacy. The legacy of the Wounded Knee massacre continues to resonate today, both within the Native American community and in the broader American consciousness. The massacre is often cited as an example of the violence and injustice that characterized the U.S. government's treatment of Native Americans, and it has become a symbol of the broader struggle for Native American rights and recognition. In the years following the massacre, the Lakota and other Native American tribes continued to fight for their rights and for recognition of the injustices committed against them. The American Indian Movement, AIM, a Native American advocacy group, occupied the site of the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1973 in a protest against the U.S. government's treatment of Native Americans. The occupation, which lasted for 71 days, brought renewed attention to the history of Wounded Knee and the ongoing struggles of Native Americans. Today, the Wounded Knee Massacre is remembered as a tragic and pivotal event in American history. The site of the massacre is a place of remembrance and reflection, and it serves as a reminder of the need for reconciliation and justice for Native Americans. Conclusion: the Battle of Wounded Knee, or the Wounded Knee Massacre, was a tragic and defining moment in the history of the United States and the Native American tribes. The 7th Cavalry Regiment, with its storied history and complex legacy, played a central role in the events of that day. The actions of the 7th Cavalry, driven by a combination of revenge, racial animosity, and a desire to suppress Native resistance, resulted in the deaths of hundreds of Lakota men, women, and children. The massacre at Wounded Knee marked the end of the Indian Wars and the final defeat of the Lakota resistance, but it also left a lasting legacy of trauma and injustice. The events of December 29, 1890, continue to resonate today, serving as a reminder of the need for reconciliation, justice, and recognition of the rights and sovereignty of Native American tribes. As we reflect on the role of the 7th Cavalry Regiment in the Battle of Wounded Knee, it is important to remember the human cost of the massacre and to honor the memory of those who lost their lives. The story of Wounded Knee is a painful one, but it is also a story of resilience, resistance, and the ongoing struggle for justice and equality.